This video is for your Unit 7 study guide. So Unit 7 talked about quadratics, and that is one of the functions that we talk about in Math 1. So remember that when we graph a quadratic, what you are going to see is what we call a parabola. So that's either going to look like a smiley face or a frowny face. So they are U-shaped graphs that either open up like this one or open down like this one. Alright, so in the first one on your study guide, it says use the graph of the quadratic below to answer the following questions. So we can tell that this particular parabola is a parabola that opens down like a smiley or like a frowny face. And because it opens down, that means that it is going to have an absolute highest point where no other points go past that point. And so that point is right here. So the first question is the vertex a maximum or a minimum? Give the coordinates. So the vertex is going to be either the highest or the lowest point. And because this one is at the absolute highest point, that means that this one is a maximum. And so if we wanted to give the coordinates for that maximum, we would say that that maximum is at -2, +4. What is the axis of symmetry? So remember that the axis of symmetry is an imaginary line that is going to divide our parabola into two equal parts. That imaginary line is going to cut right through our vertex, which in this case is our maximum. So I'm going to draw in my imaginary axis of symmetry here, and I'm going to give the equation for that. Now, because it is always a vertical line, that means it's going to be x equals, and it's going to be x equals whatever the value of our x is in our vertex, or wherever our axis of symmetry crosses the x-axis, which in this case is at -2. So our axis of symmetry is at x equals -2. Now remember, whenever you write a vertex, you want to write it as a coordinate because it is a point that's on the graph. And when you write an axis of symmetry, you want to write it as x equals whatever your x value is. And the reason that you write it as x equals is because it is the equation of the line of the axis of symmetry. And so part C asks you for what are the roots. Now there are several words that mean roots that we've talked about. So roots mean the same thing as zeros, which mean the same thing as solutions, which mean the same thing as x-intercepts. And so basically what this question is asking us for is, what are the x-intercepts? And the x-intercepts is just where this graph crosses the x-axis. So the x-axis is our horizontal axis, and we can see that it crosses right here and right here. So we might say that our roots are x equals 0 and x equals -4. We could also write those roots as coordinates. So we might say that our roots are at 0, 0 or at -4, 0. Now remember, that question could have been worded in 3 other ways. So that question could have said, what are the zeros? Or what are the solutions, or what are the x-intercepts? And it would be appropriate for you to answer either way here, either x equals 0 and x equals -4, or to answer as coordinates 0, 0 and -4, 0. Number 2 asks us to draw the graph of a quadratic with zeros at -2, 4, and a minimum of -5. So we are going to go ahead and zeros mean that these are our x-intercepts. So we're going to go ahead and put our x-intercepts at -2 and +4. So there's 1, and that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 would be our other. Now, because it's a minimum, that means that we must have a graph that looks like this. So we must have a smiley face graph. A minimum would be the point that's at the absolute bottom. No points go past that point. So I know that I can put my axis of symmetry right through that vertex. And so that axis of symmetry is going to split our parabola into half. Now if I know where my roots are, I can figure out how much distance is between them. So if I'm here at -2, that means that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places in between this root at -2 and this root at 4. Now, if there's 6 places and I have an axis of symmetry that splits that parabola into 2, that means I can divide that 6 by 2 and get 3. So what I'm going to do is from the root, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 over, and that's where my axis of symmetry is going to be. And remember that on your axis of symmetry is your vertex. So now that I know my axis of symmetry is here, I know I can put my minimum at -5. So I'm going to go on that axis of symmetry, and I'm going to go down 5 places from the x-axis. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that puts my vertex right there. Now my problem tells me it's a minimum, which tells us again that that means that my parabola must open up. So now I can use my 2 roots and my vertex and connect them all, and so I'm going to get a parabola that's going to look something like this. Now remember, on your test you are going to have a multiple choice test, and so you're going to be looking for which of those graphs have all of these characteristics. So they've got to have 0 at -2, a 0 at 4, and then a minimum at 5, or -5. And on your test, you'll be given graph paper, so you'll be able to graph out those if you need to, or you could just look at the graphs that are provided for you and find the one that has all the things that you needed to have. Next question is number 3, which says, what is the line of symmetry? So the line of symmetry, axis of symmetry, that would be the line that cuts my parabola into half. So what I could do is, I know that this point right here, or about that point right there, would be my vertex, and my axis of symmetry is going to go right through that vertex. So I'm going to have to kind of estimate, because I can tell that my vertex, or my axis of symmetry rather, is not going to be perfect. It's not going to sit perfectly on one of these pretty points. So I'm going to have to guess where I think it is. Now it looks to me like it's right between 0 and 1. So I'm going to say that this is at 0.5. Now because it is a line of symmetry, I want to write the equation for that line. And because it's a vertical line, it's going to be an x equals. So it's going to be x equals 0.5 or 0.5. Number 2 says, what are the zeros of the quadratic function f of x equals x squared plus x minus 20? So remember that zeros is a fancy way to say roots, or solutions, or x-intercepts. So any of those would work. Now on this time though, we're not given a graph, so we're going to have to do it by hand. So whenever we have to get our x-intercepts, our roots, our solutions, our zeros by hand, we're going to have to do the star method. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this f of x, which just means y. It just means y equals x squared plus x minus 20. We're going to have to replace that y with a 0. So we're going to say 0 equals x squared plus x minus 20. Now there were 2 methods that we did by hand to be able to find those, and that was the star, and we also did the square root method. But remember, with square root method, you were kind of limited because you had to only have 2 parts to that. You could only have an x squared term, and you could only have a constant. So if I look at this one, I've got an x squared, I've got my constant, but I also have that plus x in the middle, which means that for this one, our best option is to do the star method. Now, if I do the star method, I have to know what each piece is. And so remember, with all quadratics, it's written as ax squared plus bx plus c. And so to do my star, I'm going to start by labeling what my a is, what my b is, and what my c is. So a is going to come from the value in front of x squared, which in this case is an imaginary 1. B is going to come from the value in front of x, which in this case is a positive 1. And my c is going to be my constant, which in this case is negative 20. So once I get my a, my b, and my c, I'm going to go over to the side, and draw out my star. I'm going to label my star as AX, A times C, AX, question mark, B, and question mark. And then I'm going to fill in my A, B, and C from what we said A, B, and C were equal to over here. So AX is going to be 1x, so I'm going to have 1x and 1x. In the middle here at A times C, I'm going to have 1 times negative 20, which is negative 20, and my B is going to be positive 1. So to get my two imaginary numbers, my two question marks, I'm going to be looking for two numbers that are going to multiply to give me negative 20, but that will add to give me positive 1. So I'm going to go over here to the side to do a little bit of work to figure out what that's going to be. So remember, I want to multiply to get negative 20, add to get positive 1. Now what I think is easiest to do is just worry about just 20. How do I multiply to get 20? So to multiply to get 20, I could do 1 times 20, I could do 2 times 10, or I could do 4 times 5. Now because it has to multiply to give me a negative, I want a negative, 1 negative, and 1 positive. Now to do that, to figure out which one of my numbers, because in my number sets I've got a smaller number and a bigger number, to figure out which number is going to be my negative, I'm going to look at my B, and B is going to tell me about that bigger number. So if I look at this B, B is positive. So because B is positive, that means that when I go to add these two numbers together, I want to have more positives than I do negatives. So because B is positive, I want my bigger numbers to be positive, which means that my smaller numbers are going to have to be my negatives. So in this case, I'm going to have negative 1 times 20, negative 2 times 10, and negative 4 times 5. So I could go through and add those number pairs together. So negative 1 plus 20 would give me positive 19. Negative 2 plus 10 would give me positive 8. And then negative 4 plus 5 would give me my positive 1 that I need. So this answer is out, and this answer is out, which means I'm going to have to go with negative 4 and positive 5. So now I'm going to see if I can reduce the sides of my star. So I've got 1 over negative 4, and that will not reduce. I've got 1 over 5, and that will not reduce. So that means I'm going to keep those. So I'm going to now use those as my parentheses, x minus 4 times x minus 5. But remember, x minus 4 times x minus 5 is just another way for us to write x squared plus x minus 20. So because I had intentionally set that x squared plus x minus 20 equal to 0, I should set this x minus 4 times x minus 5 equal to 0, because that and this mean the same thing. So at this point, now I've got this equal to 0. I know that either this part or this part is going to have to be equal to 0 in order for me to take these two things and multiply them together to get 0. So what I'm going to do now is take my sets of parentheses and set them equal to 0 individually. And then I'm going to solve for x by adding 4 on this side. That should be a positive 5. So I get x equals positive 4, or subtracting 5 here and getting x equals negative 5. So I can get my two zeros as x equals 4 and x equals negative 5. I could also see those written as coordinates. So let me go over here because I don't have enough room and put this as 4, 0. Or I could see it as x equals 5 and that being x equals negative 5 and that being negative 5, 0. So I could see it written as x equals 4, x equals negative 2, or x equals 4, x equals negative 5, or I might see it as 4, 0 and negative 5, 0. Number 5 says, what are the coordinates of the x-intercepts of the graph y equals x plus 6 times x minus 7? So again, this one's asking us for x-intercepts, but it could have said roots, it could have said solutions, or it could have said zeros in place of that word x-intercepts. Remember, those all mean the same thing. So for this one has already been factored for us. So instead of having to go through and do the star method like we had to do in number 4, because we've already got the factors, we can just set them equal to 0. So we're going to take each one of these factors, x plus 6 and x minus 7, and we're going to set them equal to 0 separately, and then solve for x. So we're going to subtract 6 on both sides here to get those to cancel and us to get x equals negative 6. We're going to add 7 to both sides here to get those to cancel and us to get x equals positive 7. So our two answers would be x equals negative 6 and x equals 7. And one last thing that's definitely important that we've already talked about several times today, but x-intercepts, solutions, roots, and zeros all mean the same thing, and you will see those words, each of those words, show up on your test when you take your test on Thursday, and those words will be used interchangeably.